Hey there, friends! Today, I'm going to show you the true power of the Spanish bishop. The Spanish bishop is this light-squared bishop, and it's called that because we can reach it, for example, through the Ruy Lopez opening, also known as the Spanish opening. But the thing is, this bishop doesn't just appear in that opening. We're going to find it in a ton of our games. For example, in the French defense exchange variation, whenever the bishop is placed on the diagonal running from a2 to g8, whenever we find a bishop on this diagonal, we need to keep in mind everything I'm going to explain to you in this video. For example, in the Spanish opening or Ruy Lopez, which is the most common because the bishop ends up there right away, or in the Italian opening, after knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, attacking this knight. You could also place it directly on this diagonal in the Italian opening, but we're explaining it with the Spanish opening because in fact, that's where its name comes from. From this opening, after the moves a6, bishop to a4, b5, and bishop to b3, we already have this bishop directly aiming at the f7 square. As you'll see, I'm going to explain different characteristics of this Spanish bishop with some examples, and I'm sure many of you didn't know you could do all these things as long as you have this bishop on this diagonal. So you understand me, before we start, I'm going to show you a completely normal example, as you can see here. Both the white and black pieces have developed in a very natural way, and we can see that the only important feature of the position is that this bishop is precisely on the diagonal, and therefore this bishop is a Spanish bishop. As you can see here, the white pieces already have a very simple plan to win the game, even though it might look like this is a completely normal and very balanced game. Before I explain it to you, let me mention that if you're a bit weak on openings, which happened to me at first, you can review them in the same app I use, which I'll leave for you right down here in the description, as always. I know many of you have already tried it and are loving it, so just so you know, as always, I'll leave it for you down here in the description. The idea here is that, for example, we could play a perfectly normal move like bishop to g5, right? This would be a traditional move. We're really doing exactly the same thing as the player with the black pieces. The difference is key. We're pinning this queen that's on d8, and our queen is on d3, just a bit better placed, so this knight has mobility, even though we really don't care about that at all. Just so you know, here a move as typical as h6, trying to chase away this bishop, would already be a mistake, and I'll explain why. The idea is that we have the Spanish bishop that's really well placed, whether it's here or if they play b5 and we put it on b3, or even if we have it on a2, you'll see that its importance is the same. In this case, the importance of this bishop is that it's targeting the king through this f7 square. That is, this pawn can't move because it's completely pinned by the bishop. The idea here is simply that we should bring our bishop back. And after any move by our opponent, whether it's queen to a5, queen to e7, or rook to e8, let's say rook to e8, for example, we would have this plan to play h3, and that would force our opponent to give up the bishop pair. That's right, just as you heard. Surely many of you would say, well, here the most natural move in the world is h5, and it is. But here you would see the true power of this Spanish bishop, because after the move g4, the bishop would be completely trapped and couldn't be saved anymore. The typical move bishop to g6 wouldn't be possible here because the pawn on f7 is pinned by the bishop, so we would continue with queen takes g6, completely capturing this light-squared bishop, and all thanks to the Spanish bishop. And now let's see the true power of the Spanish bishop, in an example that demonstrates it perfectly. Those of you who study chess seriously will probably realize that you already know this game, because this is the game between Fischer and Gligoric from the 1959 Candidates Tournament. It's a pretty well-known game. The game continues like this, c5. As you can see, this isn't the Spanish opening, but that doesn't matter. The only important thing is to place the bishop on the diagonal we mentioned, knight to f3, knight to c6, with Gligoric entering the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, although you'll see that after d4, pawn takes and knight takes. After a couple of moves, knight to f6 attacking the pawn, and knight to c3 developing the pieces in a super simple way and defending this pawn, d6. And bishop to c4. Fischer always placed this bishop on c4. Always. In fact, in the Sicilian, when the bishop is placed on c4, it's also known as Fischer's bishop. Just imagine, he put it on c4 so often that this move even bears his name. As I was saying, in this defense after bishop to d7, bishop to b3 is a prophylactic move, since he wants to keep this bishop at all costs on this square and on this diagonal. Surely many of you are thinking, well, here a move like knight to a5 would pretty much force the exchange of this bishop, right? You'll see what happens, because we'll look at it a little later in the game. The player with the black pieces transforms the classical Sicilian, this is what I wanted to tell you, into a dragon Sicilian with this g6 move. You already know that here he could continue with the move e6 to develop the bishop, or even with e5, although that's not really recommended. Playing these kinds of e5 moves isn't advisable. When the bishop is placed on the Spanish diagonal, why is that? Because you're completely weakening yourself and basically telling your opponent, attack me here whenever you want, since when the king is in the center, this point is going to be super vulnerable, and even more so once I castle, because then it'll be pinned, right? So it might be a bit smarter to play e6 in these kinds of positions, or go for the dragon variation with the move g6. f3, a typical move in the English attack or Yugoslav attack. What this allows is precisely to set up the battery with bishop to e3 and queen to d2, something that wouldn't be possible without this pawn on f3, since after bishop to e3, knight to g4 would follow, and this bishop would be very badly placed, probably having to be given up in exchange for the knight. Since we don't want that, we play f3 first, which not only supports this point, but also allows the bishop to be placed on e3, and also helps and supports this pawn push with g4 and h4 in the future, which we already know Fischer is going to carry out, because whenever this kind of Yugoslav attack is used, the pawns are launched against the enemy king. Right here, Gligoric plays the move knight to a5, threatening this bishop. Alright, let me explain what's happening here. Actually, this kind of move is what the player with the black pieces wants to make when the bishop is on c4, but not when the bishop is on b3. What you really want to do is play rook to c8 and use that to support placing this knight on c4, which is a very strong position. Normally, what the white pieces should do is exchange this bishop for the knight, since this knight is so powerful and controls such interesting squares like e3 and d2, which we'll use to set up our battery, so it's almost forced to trade off this knight. But don't capture here, because once you take here, you would recapture with the c-pawn, even though it goes against our intuition. From the typical rule that always tells us to capture from the outside in, right? When the king castles and moves to b1, it would be in a great position. Therefore, here the black pieces don't want to get rid of this bishop just yet. That is to say, for now, our Spanish bishop is quite safe. Here, Fischer continues with bishop to g5. His idea is clear, right? Now, after, for example, bishop to g7, queen to d2, what he's doing is trying to they should go with bishop to h6, using the typical bishop and queen battery to eliminate the guardian of the opponent's castling, which is the dark squared bishop. You already know that whenever there's a fianchettoed castling, this is the fianchetto. The idea is to try to eliminate this bishop at all costs, because once it's gone, the dark squares will be extremely weak, since the pawns are on light squares. h6, of course, here black is weakening their position, do you see that? They're driving out the bishop, which can retreat without any problem, but at what cost? At the cost that now, for example, we can't castle, because then this pawn would fall easily. So here, it's true, they forced our bishop to retreat, but they've simply done it at the expense of weakening themselves. And not only that, but now the Spanish bishop becomes even more important. It becomes more important mainly because of this g6 square. Since the h-pawn is moved, it no longer defends it. And the f7 pawn does for now, but once the king castles, it won't defend it anymore either. You see, because the bishop would be pinned in the f7 pawn thanks to the x-ray against the king on g. Rook to c8, long castle, all of that. It makes perfect sense. Anyone who plays the Sicilian will understand that this is the classic lifelong attack, where black castles short and white attacks on the queen side. It's the typical Yugoslav attack, where black will undoubtedly try this minority attack with these two pawns, and especially with the open c-file and a possible queen entry via a5, carrying out an attacking maneuver on that flank. And watch out, because now comes the move we just talked about a moment ago, bishop to c4, attacking our queen and our bishop. This is the good bishop, because it's on dark squares and all our pawns are on light squares, so it has much more mobility. And do you know what Fischer did here? He didn't give up his Spanish bishop. Instead, he pulled back the queen and gave up his good bishop. He gave up the good bishop. Also, now we can't attack this h6 square anymore, so castling is no longer a problem at all. So that's what they did. Why did they make this move? For just one reason: to keep the Spanish bishop on this diagonal. Just for that reason alone, it was already worth it. And to get rid of the bishop on e3, which in this case is so important. The game continues with g4. Obviously, you have to go on the attack when there are opposite side castlings. One side is castled on one side and the other on the opposite. You always have to attack aggressively, since the side that attacks first is usually the one that wins. Queen to a5. Now they're starting to target squares like c3 and sometimes a2, so at some point we're going to have to play king to b1. That move was going to be very important. The game continues with h4, pushing forward, not for the pawns, e6, knight from d to e2, a prophylactic move against the typical exchange sacrifices, rook takes c3, which you've probably seen on the channel. The other day, I uploaded a great video about when the exchange sacrifice works. It's very important, and you should know it because it's one of the most thematic sacrifices, and many times you have to do it by force to get a better position. If you want to watch it, you can find it on the main channel, Chess Teacher, and it's called How to Know When to Sacrifice, or something like that. You'll see it, because I uploaded it fairly recently. The idea is that now, with this knight, that typical sacrifice no longer works, because we won't even have to recapture with the pawn. We recapture with the knight, and nothing at all happens here. Alright, the game continues with rook to c6, preparing to double up on the c-file, and this turns out to be a mistake. It turns out to be a mistake because it no longer allows for a strong enough attack. I suppose those of you who have studied this game in more depth, it's in Bobby Fischer's book of his 60 best games, will understand that this is already a mistake. And it is a mistake. It would probably be better, for example, to play rook to c5, targeting especially this fifth rank. A much better move would be, for example, knight to e8. And why all this? Because here, after the move rook to c6, g5 is being threatened, a very powerful move. If, for example, knight to e8 had been played here, g5 wouldn't matter, because since the knight isn't being attacked, you play h5, everything gets closed off, and nothing happens here. You see it? The big difference is that with rook to c6, the knight is still here, and now this g5 is extremely dangerous. We can't afford the luxury of escaping with the knight, because then pawn takes pawn would follow, the bishop would still be under attack, it's well defended, and this would be a real disaster. So here, after this advance with g5, it's pawn takes pawn, and pawn takes pawn. You always ask me when I do these kinds of maneuvers. It's because it ends up exactly the same. If you capture here first, and then capture here, what you've done is just remove these two pawns, and it's just a way for me to do it a bit faster. Pawn takes pawn, I do this, and that's it. I'm saying this because some of you who are more casual players or just starting out might not understand these kinds of moves. It's okay, I'll explain it. Now the knight is threatened, and what it does is the knight moves back to the h5 square, completely closing off the h-file. As you know, one of the most typical ways to open the h-file here is by even sacrificing the rook, a very aggressive approach for the knight, but also very effective. It's true that we're giving up material, but what happens is that we're leaving the enemy king totally exposed, and he's losing his best defender, which is this knight that normally sits on f6, but right now is on h5. The game continues with f4, and as you can see, white is already going straight for an f5 push. And when this f5 is played, you'll also see the tremendous power of the Spanish bishop, since this pawn is going to become extremely vulnerable, right? So here, the black pieces try to look for their typical counterplay, because if they don't, as you'll see, white is going to launch an attack and there will be no stopping them. Logically, it's already clear that the king is under heavy attack, so king to b1 is now practically a must. King b1 is a move you should always make when you castle long. Always. But even the king on c1 only brings trouble. This pawn can become weak once the pieces move away, and the queen can get in. Also, if the queen ends up on c2 at some point, with the help of the rooks, it's going to be checkmate. But when the king is on b1, that's not the case, because it can always escape through a1. Therefore, the king on b1, not only does it make room for the rooks and defend the three pawns, but it will always be better than on c1. The game continues with queen b6. They're trying to trade queens, but that's not good for us because we have a very strong attack on this side, so the queen absolutely has to move away. Rook to c5. This is key because now f5 is directly threatened, and with the rook on c6, it would be absolutely devastating. Now that the queen is also supporting this point, and the Spanish bishop keeps putting pressure along the diagonal, so rook to c5 is a crucial move. The idea is that now, if you check this with your friends or with chess engines, they'll probably tell you that the best move is the exchange sacrifice with rook takes h5. And in fact, it was the best move. But Fischer chose the more provocative maneuver, and what he did was place his queen on d3. Not with the idea of putting pressure on the d6 square, which is now weak. No, because putting pressure on d6 would not be a good idea, and I'll explain why. If now white were to capture on d6, let's imagine it's white's turn, right? After the exchange of queens, black would surely have relieved a lot of the pressure. Therefore here, after the move bishop takes c3, it's an interesting move because it makes this knight leave the defense of the square. On f4, black can now take this square here. Is that a good idea? No, it's not a good idea, my friend. Even though the position was already completely lost for black, and you'll see why, capturing this pawn with the knight, even though it wins a pawn, actually just helps Fischer make the attack even easier. Let me explain. Sometimes the pawn gets in our way, and this pawn was really bothering us at this moment. After the move queen to f3, the knight has to go back, and we're in the same situation as before, with one small difference. Now the f-file has also been opened up. And since we no longer have our pawn on f4, we can now launch a devastating attack on the f7 square with our rooks. And don't forget, in any case, this bishop is also aiming at the f7 square. Therefore, any kind of attack could end up being completely devastating. So now, after this knight to h5, Fischer simply makes an aggressive but safe maneuver at this point, which is the exchange sacrifice right here. After pawn takes, the queen captures on h5, and as you can see, the threat is already starting to become lethal. It's going to start breaking open with g6, and this bishop is going to become even more important. There's something you need to know here. After the move bishop to e8, trying to prevent this kind of advance which would be lethal, surely many of you would be thinking about playing rook to h1, which would be a good move, I'm not saying it wouldn't, or rook to g1, but that would allow Gligoric, in this case, to escape through the back door, as it's called, and bring the king to safety. So look at the subtle move you can always use, which seems like a waste of time. Queen to h6, which precisely serves to cut off the diagonal and prevent the king from escaping, so it leaves the king trapped on the g8 square. As you can see, what the queen does is keep the king from moving to either side, or to the other, and so now all we have to do is bring the rook and deliver checkmate. Gligoric tries his last move, which is rook takes f3. It would be a mistake now to bring the rook into the attack and rush to attack, because then a move like queen to d4 would defend against mate, and be careful, because here the game would get very complicated. Therefore, after the move rook takes f3, Fischer simply recaptured the rook, and now, with this pawn covering, thanks to it, the d6 square is covered, and black is now completely out of options. They have to capture this pawn no matter what to try to defend. They have no other choice. But instead of rook to h1, the move g6 comes directly, and this is already completely devastating. If it's captured, the Spanish bishop comes in through e6 and ends up delivering a beautiful checkmate. The idea is that once it's captured here, first, well, it captured because there's no other choice, right? Let me show you this. If now, for example, black decided to make any other move, like, I don't know, just making something up, queen to c6, simply g takes f7 would open the whole file. The rook and bishop would come in, and it would be mate in just a few moves. You can check it out for yourselves. So here, there's no other way to try to hold on than to capture this pawn. The idea is that once this pawn is captured, now the king really can't escape, thanks to that. The bishop is covering this area, so don't capture right away, even though it wouldn't be a bad move. If you did capture immediately, we'd first have to move the king aside, right? Because the queen is pinning the bishop, and then black might have time to defend, so instead, directly. Rook to h1 now seems like a much better move, trying to get in through the h8 square, or if not, through h7, and after d4. Defending the h8 square, simply d7 check. And here, black already resigned. The only possible square is king to f8, and for example, after rook to f1, taking advantage of the open file created because Gligoric captured with the knight on f4, this would end up being mate in just a few moves. First, they'd have to give up the rook, and then they'd have to give up the queen and the bishop, you see? And this would end up being mate. Therefore, a very important lesson is that the bishop, without even moving, simply by being on this diagonal, has enabled all these kinds of attacks against the opponent's king. You should try to start using this bishop on c4, or at least be aware, whether you're playing with it or against it, of its strengths and characteristics, because it really goes unnoticed, especially at slightly lower levels. But this bishop is truly lethal. I hope you really enjoyed this video. You already know that if you want to try the app to study openings, I'll leave it for you down here in the description. And we'll see each other tomorrow, as always, in the next one, my friends.